Today, the conspiracy within the conspiracy. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to his post covering finance and prop news with a distinctively Australian flavour. Today, I'm joined by a man in black. Hello.
Hello.
Good to see you. Now, we're going to talk conspiracies and why conspiracies are conspiracies. It seems to me that, particularly through the COVID season, but even before that, there's been a growing number of wackier and wackier conspiracy theories. You know, everything from 5G and Bill Gates, and it's a plan to reset the economy. I mean, pretty much every stone you turn over, you can find a new conspiracy. Now, I'm just trying to get from a sociological perspective, and of course, that's really where your centre of gravity lies. I'm just interested in what's your opinion as to why we're seeing all of these weird things coming out. Is it social media allowing it to happen, or is it something else?
Well, your conspiracy theory is my hard science, Martin, and that's something it's something we always need to remember. I mean, I'd like to remind everybody about a fantastic incident from my own youth that I was transfixed with when I was in elementary school, and that's the 1974 Glomar Explorer Expedition. Covered on the cover of National Geographic magazine, Howard Hughes, the reclusive billionaire, had for those who don't know him, he's a pioneering aviator who then owned a Las Vegas casino. He was parodied in James Bond. He was the Elon Musk meets Virgin, Richard Branson chief of his day. And Howard Hughes built a ship, the only one of its kind in the world, with a massive lift capacity to be able to go to the center of the Pacific Ocean and mine manganese modules from a hotspot in the Central Pacific, literally on the cover of National Geographic. This amazing effort by this amazing entrepreneur. Now, the New York Times broke the conspiracy theory a year later that what they were actually doing, it was a cover for a CIA operation to lift a Soviet nuclear submarine that had been grounded and sunk on the seafloor deeper than any shipwreck had ever been salvaged before. Now, of course, that turned out to be true. And in the 1990s, there was Bill Clinton apologizing to Boris Yeltsin for the incident. Now, today, we hear that, in fact, it wasn't the retrieval of a Soviet submarine. Even that was itself a cover for the true CIA secret operation, which was to tap Russian undersea cables. Well, what's the truth? Hard to tell, right? And of course, I have my own brush with this with the coronavirus. Back in early February, I was hosting an event about or how the coronavirus was likely to affect the stability of the Chinese regime. A reporter for the Epoch Times, which is closely associated with Falun Dafa, Falun Gong, raised the question, what do your panelists think about the idea that this was all a release from a Chinese virology lab in Wuhan? Now, I have to admit that at the time, early February, I had never heard of the Institute of Virology in Wuhan, or the fact that Wuhan researchers were doing bat coronavirus research. Now, so I as the moderator of this panel, I poured cold water on the question. This came out of the blue. It wasn't something I wanted to discuss. I have to admit, in my mind, Falun Gong, secret Chinese virology lab, it sounded a lot like a conspiracy theory to me. Well, who should be writing in April an article saying that there now seemed to be a real consensus outside the virology community that, in fact, the coronavirus probably originated in the Wuhan virus lab? Well, me. So what first confronted me as a conspiracy theory later struck me as really the most probable explanation of the fact that the Wuhan coronavirus happened to pop up in Wuhan just 100 meters from a virus lab investigating bat coronaviruses. And it didn't pop up in Yunnan province, where SARS had popped up, where coronaviruses have typically popped up, because that's where the bats are, right? So conspiracy theory or leading us towards the truth, in retrospect, it can be very easy to separate those out. At the time, of course, the label of conspiracy theory is often used by the establishment to assert its authority. I mean, at this point, I think the only people who believe that the lab release theory for coronavirus is a conspiracy theory and not a legitimate explanation for the possible origins of the outbreak in Wuhan, the only people who adamantly refuse to believe that are virologists who do lab work on coronavirus, for whom it is absolutely important to quash any idea that the coronavirus might have originated in a lab. Since, of course, that calls into question their own funding, their own lab safety procedures, potentially getting their labs shut down where they're doing research on things like smallpox, which, need I remind everybody, the very last case of smallpox in the world did not occur in some remote village in Africa or Afghanistan. It occurred in England, where it escaped from a virology lab.
Yeah, and you're making a really important point, which is one person's theory or one person's conspiracy could be another person's truth. And so there's got to be a mechanism to allow those different theories and different ideas to at least, come out into the open and be looked at. But obviously, quite often you find authorities are trying to filter the truth and, discarding X, Y, and Z to try and actually make the truth fit their particular model.
Well, there are lots of incorrect theories in the world. I mean, personally, I happen to believe that it's incorrect to suspect a link, for example, between vaccination and autism. This is something I teach in my classes. Is there a link between vaccination and autism? Well, serious medical professionals have at times believed there was. The weight of scientific evidence now seems to be that there isn't. Notice I couch this in terms of uncertainty. Yeah. Now, those who call it a conspiracy theory are appealing to their own authority as experts. That is, the very term conspiracy theory is an authoritarian term. It's a term that says, I, the expert, or someone who is anointed an expert, has the authority to acknowledge or dismiss theories, to rule them in bounds or out of bounds. And I think that's fundamentally the problem. Look, the problem is not that they're wrong theories. I strongly suspect that the theory that coronavirus comes from 5G mobile phone towers, I strongly suspect that that's incorrect. I mean, there's no plausible biology behind it. There's no plausible correlation behind it. It just seems to come out of nowhere. But that said, I strongly suspect that theory will fall by the wayside, precisely because it's implausible. There's no correlation behind it. It's pretty easy over the long run to see these incorrect theories dismissed. But dismissing it by calling it a conspiracy theory is not a way of engaging with it scientifically. It's a way of engaging with it using the authority that we try to assume as people in the media, as experts. It's us saying you're not allowed to think that way. And that's why I think it's a problem. I never call anything a conspiracy theory, well, unless it's a theory about a conspiracy. And usually those are pretty rare. Most of what we call conspiracy theories are simply theories that authorities, for one reason or another, don't want to entertain. And I emphasize, it's not that they're wrong. There are many theories we don't want to entertain that later prove to be right. That doesn't make them conspiracies.
Right, and I guess one which is sort of very current is the fact that China's been now saying, well, Chinese visitors should be very careful of coming to Australia because of, racial attacks and those sorts of things, right? Now, there are people out there who say this is a conspiracy theory and it's all about the China-Australian relationship, and there are others. So
yeah, I would file that under the label fake news instead of under the label conspiracy theory. I think conspiracy theories are really about citizen scientists, about people who are not credentialed to be presenting evidence who are nonetheless concerned. For example, I'll give you another actual example. Love Canal in the United States. Love Canal was the environmental disaster that led to the kickoff of the environmentalist movement in the United States. Love Canal was this terribly polluted industrial waste spot. It's now what's called an EPA Superfund site near Buffalo, New York. And of course, at the time, parents were complaining, my kid has this skin rash. A lot of people in this neighborhood seem to be getting cancer. And the authorities at the time, by which I mean the state epidemiologist of New York, dismissed these as, I don't think he used the word conspiracy theories, but dismissed it as fantasies of people who don't know what they're talking about. Now, in fact, of course, it turned out that there had been a chemical plant on that site since the 19th century. It was later used as a dumping ground for PVCs. It was plowed over and turned into the site for a school, not just for housing, but for a school. And kids in the playground who fell down in the playground were getting chemical burns on their skin. Now, every theory like this doesn't turn out to be true, but with worrying regularity, things that are dismissed by authorities, by authoritative figures as conspiracy theories being promulgated by an ignorant population, with worrying regularity, those turn out to actually be true. Now, I want to be clear. I suspect the vast majority of popular theories promulgated by an ignorant population do turn out to be false, but they're not all false. And this is really about the distribution of power in society, not about truth with big T, capital letters. It's about who has the power to label other views as being illegitimate or unacceptable. Those who do like to use the term conspiracy theory to dismiss things that they don't want to address.
And I guess does that flow into the media as well? I mean, is the media filtering and selecting and saying, well, we think that's true and we think that's a conspiracy? Is that part of the process too?
Well, so here, the autism vaccine link is a great example. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, the media was promulgating the idea that there was a conspiracy among epidemiologists to suppress the link between vaccines and autism. Your ABC even ran a documentary on the truth of the link between vaccines and autism and the conspiracy among authorities in Australia to suppress that truth. Now, of course, the ABC has gone exactly the opposite, and the ABC is ridiculing parents as conspiracy theorists for being worried about their children being given vaccines. Now, what's the truth there? It's very it's very difficult to say. Again, I think the balance of evidence is that vaccines are largely harmless. Do vaccines cause occasional reactions? Sure, they do. Do they cause autism? Probably not. Can we definitively say so? No, because we're not prepared to do experimental science on this. That is, we're not prepared to, give half the population vaccines and not give the other half and see which part ends up with a higher autism rate. And since we're not willing to do experimental science on things like this, we should accept a degree of doubt. We have to be more modest in our conclusions about what's a conspiracy and what's not.
And isn't that really the point, that, perhaps we should be coming off our pinnacle of idealism and say it's always that and we know precisely, and recognise that quite often we don't know, and there actually are various different ways of explaining what we're seeing, and trying to perhaps create a little bit more uncertainty at one level, but also a little bit more reality at another level.
Well, for me, this goes back to a big debate in philosophy between the American pragmatists and the philosophical establishment represented at the time by Bertrand Russell of the UK, but in general, between philosophers who wanted rationality. The dominant trend in philosophy has been towards rational explanation, and that's a very, dare I say it, European approach to philosophy. The American tradition, on the other hand, not in academic philosophy, but in practical life has been what we call pragmatism. It's been, let's get to a solution that works. We may not know why it works. We may not be able to rationally explain it, but if it works well enough, let's go with it. So we may not know whether vaccines truly cause autism. In fact, there's a profound uncertainty there. We can't, by design, find out whether or not vaccines cause autism because we can't do the experiment. So in conditions of uncertainty like that, the American approach of his pragmatist school, which would be people you would have heard of, like John Dewey was the most famous American pragmatist. The pragmatic approach would be, well, does everything seem to be going okay? Well, we've killed childhood diseases. If we stop giving vaccines, those childhood diseases come back. Autism seems to be more treatable than measles, say. There doesn't, we haven't noticed a real reduction in autism among people who have refused to get vaccinated. So pragmatically, we can't tell the truth. The pragmatist says we never know what the truth is with a capital T, but we can come to a solution that works. And that approach has been behind, I think, a lot of American success in everything from democracy to autonomous vehicles. That is, the approach has said, let's just see what works. And if it works, let's go with it. Even if in theory it's a bad system, if in practice it works. And there's that old joke, sometimes it's originally it was the Heidelberg professor, it later became the French academician, but it's always some butt of joke, some professor, where the professor says, yes, that works in practice, but can it work in theory? And of course, we don't want to know if it works in theory. What we want to know is it a pragmatic solution? That anti-authoritarian approach to science and politics has a very long history in America, and I would argue it's actually the ultimate basis for democracy. I mean, if you think about it, who runs Australia? Well, that's not determined by an expert panel who decides who would be the best prime minister, the best experts to put in charge. It's you, the Australian people, who decide to run Australia. Well, what makes you qualified to select good politicians? And someone might say, well, you're not selecting good politicians. Well, maybe you are, maybe you aren't. But democracy is based on the idea that is ultimately premised on the assumption that, well, we can trust ordinary people to make these decisions. Well, if you can trust ordinary people to make decisions about, should Australia have nuclear power? Should Australia have socialized medicine? Should Australia have, and fill in the blank? Well, then I think you also can trust ordinary people to make decisions about things like vaccination or things like how to behave when there's a coronavirus around. Ultimately, this is all part and parcel of the same thing. The conspiracy theory is the price you pay for having democracy.
I really appreciate your perspective on this, because I think you've put your finger on something really, really important, which is that the so-called certainty principle is actually an uncertainty principle, right? We can never be totally sure about very much. And we have to live in a world where, in fact, maybe relativities and half-truths and not quite knowing the 100% story is probably where we are.
We can be reasonably certain about a few things that we can study experimentally that do not change over time, that are time invariant. Even things you can study experimentally, if they change over time, that's no good. So for example, if you can do a experiment of Boyle's law, and you can find that increasing the pressure on a balloon raises its temperature, okay, we think that there is technical term for it is unit homogeneity. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about the oxygen and nitrogen in your balloon or the oxygen and nitrogen in someone else's balloon. They're the same units. It doesn't matter. If you increase the pressure on a balloon in a lab in Australia, it'll have the same effect on temperature as if you increase the pressure on a balloon in France. Just doesn't matter. Units are invariant, right? Units are homogeneous. With human things, units are a lot more heterogeneous. So we might find that putting a lockdown order in Australia would lead to broad compliance, whereas putting the same order in France would lead to rioting, right? We just don't know, because human beings are not homogeneous units. Societies are not homogeneous units. And that means that even experimental science in the human sciences can't solve problems for all time. Now, remember, you usually can't even experiment, right? So what do? There are three levels of policy, and this is a paradigm associated with the Nobel Prize-winning economist James Heckman, that there are three levels of policy problems. The first level of policy problem is, we'd like to solve a problem with, tools we've tried out before in an environment that already exists. So we want to try out what will increasing the minimum wage do in Australia. We've increased it before in Australia. Let's see what happens now. Okay. The second difficult policy problem is, we'd like to introduce some tool to affect something, but in a new situation. So you've raised the minimum wage in Australia. Well, people in the United States are considering raising the minimum wage. What will it do there? But then the third, most profoundly difficult problem is, we'd like to solve a problem with a new tool we've come up with in a new environment. And in fact, that's always the situation, even with, say, raising the minimum wage in Australia. Well, it's been done before, but Australia in 2010 is not the same country as Australia in 2020. Right? The tool is always different. The exact policy you put together in 2010 is never going to match the policy instrument you come out with in 2020. As a result, we never actually know. We can't know what the effects of our policy will be. All we can do is think about it, openly discuss it, allow all perspectives to be heard, and come to the best solution we can. What's more, we'll never know if we made the right decision, because we can only run the experiment once. You can only put that minimum wage in once. Did we make the right decision about social distancing in Australia? Who knows? We'll never know, because we can't run an experiment all the time. And even if we ran the experiment and we compared countries that did social distancing and those that didn't, even that won't be relevant for the future, because, of course, the technologies available and the virus that hits in 10 or 20 years will be a different virus in a different technological atmosphere than hit in 2020. Right? So all we can do is use good sense. And good sense requires really that we air these problems, we talk about them, we let everyone express their opinions, and we accept that we just can't know what the right answer is. We have to do our best under conditions of profound uncertainty.
So it's really a case of welcome to the real world, isn't it? Because that's how the real world actually operates.
That is how the real world works, and it's the human world that's the problem. I mean, there's a false sense that we can, listen to the science, trust scientists. Scientists have the answers. Scientists often don't have the answers when it comes to science, but when it comes to the human world, they even less have the answers. They have opinions, and their opinions should be heard. But, some scientists told me wear face masks. Some scientists told me don't. The World Health Organization just yesterday finally came out with guidance saying maybe you should wear a face mask if you're dealing with coronavirus patients. now, previously they'd said don't use face masks. Well, who knows, right? This is highly contentious. If even the scientists who study something as simple as face masks can't come up to a solution, can you really rule out popular opinions? And that's why, to get back to the chief issue for today is conspiracy theories. That's labeling. I mean, we have consistently seen YouTube, for example, has prohibited videos that offer the theory that coronavirus is caused by mobile phone towers. Now, YouTube, being owned by Google, has an interest in eliminating the possibility of vandalism of mobile phone towers. And so maybe that's why they prohibit that viewpoint. But they'll look pretty red-faced if in 20 years it turns out that maybe 5G wavelengths in fact affected the chemistry of viruses, right? Who knows? I want to be clear. I don't think that's true, but I'm willing to hear people state their case and make up my own mind.
Yeah, and I think that's the key point from today, is that we should effectively allow the pantheon of opinions to be expressed and tested, and some will die naturally and others may create momentum and sound as though it could be pointing us in a more positive direction. But trying to turn them all off and say, no, we can't talk about that, and dismiss it as a conspiracy theory and narrow and narrow and narrow down to just one point of truth, is actually tyranny.
Well, I think this is the great lesson of the success of what people call the Anglosphere, the English-speaking peoples. If you think of France, which has always had this tradition, for example, the encyclopedists, the idea that they could encapsulate all knowledge in an authoritative encyclopedia, so that if you wanted to know something, you went there and it had the truth. Well, who now trusts the truth of the reign of Louis XIV? Right? Even at the time, in the 18th century, people didn't trust that truth. It was out of date before it was finished. In the English-speaking world, we've much more had the tradition of an open marketplace for ideas, which has become more and more open, of course, with the coming of the internet. If you don't like an idea, disagree with it. Or actually, the best thing you can do with an idea you don't like is ignore it. If you really want it to go away, just pretend you didn't hear it. But to label it, to try to quash it, to prevent people from expressing it, I think is anathema to our English American, Anglo-American, Australian traditions. It's just the wrong approach. And we should remember that the reason we have been so successful is that we have had that free competition of ideas, which, let's face it, sometimes gets things wrong, but is much more likely to avoid the serious errors of authoritarian and totalitarian regimes, which are certain that they know things that often turn out to be either false or self-serving.
Well, I appreciate your time today once again and your insights. And I think that's a really, really important lesson for us to understand that, complexity is part of the world and men in black may or may not exist.
You're welcome. And now I have to go back to my day job. But thanks for having me on the program.
Thanks very much. Take care.